3 days. That's all they gave her. 3 days after they lowered her husband into the frozen ground, they dragged Margaret Hail into a courthouse that smelled like tobacco spit and old injustice, and told her she had to marry again or lose everything Thomas ever bled for. She looked at the men seated across that table, men who smiled at funerals, men who measured grief in acres, and standing in the corner, arms crossed, face carved up like a map of bad decisions, a stranger with cold eyes and a reputation that made grown men cross the street. This was her choice. Him or nothing. If you've ever watched someone fight for what's theirs with nothing but their bare hands and pure fury, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning they buried Sheriff Thomas Hale, the sky was the color of a bad bruise. Margaret stood at the edge of the grave in her black wool dress, the one with the frayed collar she hadn't had time to mend. And she did not cry. Not because she didn't want to. Not because the grief wasn't real. It was real in the way a knife wound is real. Something dull at first, then spreading, then impossible to ignore. She didn't cry because 37 people were watching her, and every single one of them was already calculating something. She could see it in their faces. The Delaney brothers standing off to the left, hats in their hands, eyes drifting past her toward the tree line that marked the western edge of her property. Old Gerald Fitch from the land office, rocking back on his heels with his thumbs hooked into his vest like he was already drafting paperwork. Even Reverend Coles, God bless him, had that particular look ministers get when they're praying for your soul but thinking about your real estate. Thomas had been dead for 72 hours, and they were already circling. Margaret Hail was 34 years old. She had calluses on her palms from fence wire and rope. She could ride harder than most men in Ironwood Crossing, and she'd done it. She'd helped Thomas break this land when it was nothing but scrub and rattlesnake, poured 12 years of her life into the soil until something grew out of it worth protecting. But she was a widow now. And in Ironwood Crossing, in the year 1882, a widow was about 3 steps above a stray dog in terms of legal standing. She picked up a fistful of dirt and dropped it into the grave. It hit the coffin lid with a sound she would carry in her chest for a long time. I'll keep it, she thought. I swear I'll keep it, Thomas. She walked home alone. The summons arrived the next morning before breakfast. A boy no older than 14 showed up at her door. One of the Fitch kids, she recognized him, holding an envelope like it might bite him. He shoved it into her hands without making eye contact and was already backing off the porch before she could say a word. Margaret stood in her doorway in her work clothes, cup of coffee going cold in her other hand, and read it twice. By order of Ironwood Crossing. Municipal Court, the matter of the Hale property deed is to be reviewed in chambers on Friday, the 14th, at 10 o'clock in the morning. Your presence is required. She read it a third time. Then she set down her coffee, went inside, and sat at the kitchen table that Thomas had built by hand. You could still see where he'd notched the legs wrong on the first attempt and had to start over. And she thought very carefully about what this meant. She knew. She already knew. But she sat there for a long time anyway, looking at his handwriting on the calendar by the stove. He'd had a dentist appointment scheduled for next Tuesday. She put on her good boots and rode into town. Gerald Fitch's office smelled like pipe smoke and self-satisfaction. He was already seated behind his desk when she arrived, and he wasn't alone. Councilman Briggs was there, a wide, soft man who wore his wealth the way some men wear cologne, too much and offensive. And 2 other men whose names Margaret had never bothered to learn because they'd never been worth learning. Mrs. Hale, Fitch gestured to the chair across from him. Please sit. I'd rather stand. He cleared his throat. Suit yourself. He shuffled some papers in the way that men shuffle papers when they want to look important. You understand the situation with the deed. I understand you found a situation that wasn't there before Thomas died. Briggs shifted in his chair. Now, Mrs. Hale, the deed, she said, keeping her voice level, has Thomas's name and my name on it, joint property. I've been his legal wife for 11 years. The land is mine. Well, Fitch set his papers down. That's where it gets complicated. She waited. Under the Consolidated Territories Land Act of 1879, and I know that sounds technical, bear with me, A property held jointly by a married couple defaults to male inheritance in the event of the husband's death. Now, since Sheriff Hale had no sons, no brothers, and his nearest male relative is a cousin in Missouri who's filed no claim, so it goes to me, Margaret said. His wife. It should, Fitch said carefully. Except. He produced a different piece of paper. There's a provision, a rather old provision, admittedly, but still legally valid, that states a woman may not hold deed to a cattle property exceeding 150 acres unless she is under the legal protection of a male custodian, a father, brother, or husband, Margaret said flatly. Fitch had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. Husband, yes. The room was very quiet for a moment. Margaret looked at each man in turn. She took her time with it. Let them sit in it. So what you're telling me, she said slowly, is that you've found a law that hasn't been used in probably 15 years, that says I can't keep the ranch my husband and I built unless I find another man to put his name on it. We're telling you, Briggs said, jumping in with his best reasonable voice, that there are men in this territory who would be very willing to offer their protection. Their protection. She said it like she was turning the word over, checking it for rot. And that the court is prepared to be generous in terms of timeline. You'd have 60 days. 60 days to find a husband. It's not as grim as it sounds. My husband died 3 days ago. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Even Briggs seemed to feel it. Margaret pressed her hands flat against the desk and leaned forward, and she made sure her voice stayed very, very calm because she had learned a long time ago that calm was more frightening than screaming. I want to be very clear about something. Every man in this room right now is going to be remembered. By me, and eventually by everyone else, for what's happening in this office this morning. You understand that? Nobody answered. She straightened up, smoothed her coat, and turned to leave. Mrs. Hale. Fitch's voice stopped her at the door. The court has already identified a candidate. Given the circumstances, we thought it best to have a solution ready. She turned back slowly. His name is Jonas Reed. She had heard the name. In Ironwood Crossing, you heard the name Jonas Reed the way you heard about bad winters or flash floods. As a warning, something to take seriously, something that changed the landscape when it arrived. She'd never put a face to it. He's agreed to the arrangement, Fitch said in the tone of a man who thought he was being helpful. He's what? She said. A good man? Reliable? Someone I should be grateful for? Fitch said nothing. I'll be in court on Friday, she said, and I'll be bringing a lawyer. She walked out into the street. The sun was high and sharp. She stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, breathing the cold air, getting her bearings. Then she got on her horse and rode back to the ranch. She didn't find a lawyer, she found something better. She found Dora Ashby, who ran the town's only newspaper out of a room above the hardware store and who had written 3 editorials in the past year calling for reform of the exact law that was now being used against Margaret. Dora was small and quick-eyed and had ink permanently under her fingernails. They sat at Dora's work table, surrounded by typeset blocks and paper proofs, and Margaret told her everything. The Delaney brothers, Dora said when she was done, they've been trying to buy you out for 2 years. 3. And Briggs has land holdings that would benefit considerably from a rail line going through the southern quarter of your property. I know. Dora was quiet for a moment, tapping her pen against her palm. I can run something by Thursday morning, day before the hearing. I don't want sympathy. I want people to understand exactly what law they're using and why it stinks. Oh, it won't be sympathy. Dora smiled slightly. It'll be information. People get angrier about information. Margaret rode home in the late afternoon. The ranch sat in the low winter light. The barn, the paddock, the house with the slightly uneven porch that Thomas had been meaning to fix since September. The cattle were moving slow in the cold, their breath fogging in the air. Hank Pruitt, her foreman, was waiting by the fence. He was 61 years old and had worked for Thomas since before Margaret arrived. He didn't say anything, just looked at her with that weathered, careful expression he used when he already knew. They're going to try to take it, she said. I figured. I'm not going to let them. He nodded once. Figured that too. She wore her best dress to court on Friday. Not the black one, the deep burgundy with the fitted bodice that Thomas had always liked. She did it deliberately. She was done performing grief for an audience. The courtroom was fuller than she expected. Dora's editorial had run that morning, and people had read it. She could see it in the way they arranged themselves. The ranching families on one side, some of them sympathetic, some of them calculating. The town merchants and their wives on the other. And in the back, the type of men who just show up when something's happening. Judge Aldrich Crane presided. He was 60, heavy-set, with a face like old leather, and the particular neutrality of a man who had already made up his mind. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table alone. No lawyer. She'd decided against it. On the other side of the room, near the door, she saw him for the first time. Jonas Reed. She'd built an image from the stories, something larger perhaps, or more obviously dangerous. What she saw was a man in his late 30s, maybe 40, sitting with the stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago not to waste movement. He was lean rather than large, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that had been through some things. There were 2 scars, one across the left side of his jaw, one through his eyebrow, that weren't fresh. Old scars, earned and kept and forgotten. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the floor in front of him, elbows on his knees, like a man sitting in a waiting room who expected to be there a while. She looked away. Judge Crane called the proceeding to order. The next 45 minutes were the most precise humiliation Margaret had ever experienced. Everything was done legally, every word measured, every provision cited with chapter and verse from the territory's code. There was nothing anyone could grab onto and call obviously wrong. It was wrong the way a lot of things are wrong, legally, quietly, with the full weight of an institution behind it. Margaret waited until there was a pause. "May I speak?" Crane looked at her over his glasses. "This is a property hearing, Mrs. Hale, not a—" "Then let me speak about the property." A pause. He waved his hand. She stood. She had thought about what she wanted to say for 4 days. "The Hale Ranch is 183 acres, she said, speaking clearly, speaking to the room rather than the bench. "My husband and I took possession in 1870. The land had no water source and no shelter. We dug the first well ourselves. We built the house, the barn, the smokehouse. We ran cattle through 2 droughts and 1 winter that killed half our herd. We did this together. I was not a passenger on that endeavor. I was half of it." The room was very quiet. "The law you're citing," she continued, "was written in 1867, before women could hold property in their own names at all. It's a remnant, a fossil, and the fact that it's being applied 3 days after my husband's funeral to land that I built with my own hands tells you everything you need to know about why it's being applied." She looked at Briggs, then at the Delaney brothers, who were seated together in the 3rd row. "I know what my land is worth to certain people in this room. I want everyone here to know that I know." Crane cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hale, I'm not finished." She said it politely, firmly. "I understand I have no legal recourse under the current interpretation. I understand what the court is going to decide today. I'm not speaking to change it this morning. I'm speaking so that no one in this room can say later that they didn't know exactly what was being done." She sat down. The murmur that ran through the courtroom behind her sounded like a specific kind of discomfort. The kind people feel when something they've told themselves is routine is suddenly not routine anymore. Crane ruled as expected. She had 60 days to secure a custodial marriage or surrender the deed. She stood, collected her coat, and walked out. She didn't look at Jonas Reed. She heard him follow her out 20 seconds later. He caught up to her on the courthouse steps. "Mrs. Hale." She stopped but didn't turn around immediately. When she did, he was closer than she'd expected, close enough that she could see his eyes clearly for the first time. They were gray, with something tired in them. Not weak tired, more like a man who had been tired for so long he'd stopped noticing it. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "I doubt that." He almost smiled. Not quite. "You're thinking the last thing you want is a stranger with my kind of reputation being handed legal authority over your property." "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that I don't know you and you don't know me, and the fact that a judge just decided we should be married is one of the stranger things that's happened to me this week. And I've had a strange week." He was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of someone who didn't feel the need to fill silences. "I won't take anything from you," he said. "I want to say that plain. I'm not interested in the land. I'm not interested in what those men in there are interested in. Then what are you interested in? A pause. Something shifted behind his eyes briefly. A place to be for a while. Somewhere that isn't moving. She studied him for a long moment. The scars, the stillness, the way he held himself like a man braced for impact even when nothing was coming. I need time to think, she said. You've got 30 seconds, he said. And then, at her expression, I'm joking, take whatever time you need. She turned and walked toward her horse. She rode home and took 3 days. On the second night, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold and thought about Thomas. She thought about the way he used to leave his boots exactly 1 inch from the door, close enough to grab quickly if something came up in the night, far enough that he wouldn't trip on them in the dark. She thought about the particular sound of him moving around the kitchen in the early morning before she was properly awake, the creak of the third board that he always stepped around and she never did. She thought about the last conversation they'd had, which had been about the fence line on the northern pasture and whether they needed new posts before spring, and how she would give almost anything to have one more conversation about something that ordinary. She thought, I don't want another husband. I want this one back. Then she thought, but that's not one of my options. Her options were Jonas Reed, or losing everything Thomas had worked for. And he was gone. He wasn't there to lose it for. She thought about what he'd said, standing in the cold on the courthouse steps. Somewhere that isn't moving. There was something in that she recognized, though she couldn't quite name it. On the third morning, she rode into town and sent word to the boarding house where he was staying. They met at the hotel dining room. It was mid-morning, between breakfast and lunch, so mostly empty. He was already at a corner table, back to the wall, she noticed, with a clear line of sight to the door. She noticed that he noticed that she noticed. Old habit, he said when she sat down. Useful one. He ordered coffee. She ordered the same, a habit she'd developed years ago when Thomas would come home late and she'd wait up. It was easier to stay awake with something warm in her hands. I have conditions, she said. He wrapped both hands around his mug. Let's hear them. You don't enter my bedroom without invitation. You don't make decisions about the ranch without consulting me first. You don't drink in the house. You don't bring trouble to my door. Something crossed his face at the last one. That last one might be complicated, he said. I've heard the stories. Some of them are probably true. She appreciated that. The honesty of it. Is there something following you? He was quiet for long enough that it was its own answer. Nothing immediate, he said finally. Nothing I expect to arrive soon. But something. Yeah. He looked at his coffee. Something. She thought about this. It was not a small thing to think about. I have conditions too, he said. All right. If trouble comes, whatever kind, you don't try to handle it alone while I'm standing right there. I'm not interested in being a figurehead. He paused. And I want it understood between us. If this ever stops making sense for you, you say the word. I'll walk. Whatever needs to happen legally, I'll make it happen. You won't be trapped. You'd walk away from an agreement. I'd walk away from a mistake, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not what they said. They said a lot of things, most of them bad. Most of them were probably deserved, one way or another. He held her gaze steadily. I'm not trying to convince you I'm a good man. I'm trying to be honest with you about what you'd be agreeing to. I think you're someone who'd rather have the truth than the nice version. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. Yes to my conditions, or yes to the marriage. She said it like pulling a splinter, quick, before she could hesitate. For the ranch. Understood between us. He nodded once. Understood, he said. They married on a Tuesday, in the same courthouse where the order had been issued. The ceremony took 8 minutes. Crane presided with the enthusiasm of a man processing paperwork. There were no flowers. Margaret had not worn the burgundy dress. She'd worn her working clothes deliberately because she was not celebrating and she didn't intend to pretend otherwise. 3 men were watching from the back of the courtroom. Delaney brothers, one of them, and Briggs beside them. And she could feel the calculation coming off them like heat. She signed the documents. Jonas signed the documents. The judge stamped something. Congratulations, Crane said, without inflection. Outside, On the courthouse steps, the same steps, Jonas stood beside her and looked out at the main street. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. They walked to their horses in silence. She had assumed she would feel something dramatic, relief or dread, or both. What she actually felt was tired in a particular way, the exhaustion of someone who has run a long distance and not yet decided if they've reached anything worth reaching. She mounted her horse. He mounted his. She started down the street toward the road that led home, and he rode beside her, a few feet to the left, neither too close nor too far. The November wind was sharp and smelled like coming weather. From the sidewalk, she heard someone she couldn't identify say something she didn't fully catch, something that was probably meant to be overheard. She kept riding. Jonas kept riding. Halfway down the street, he said, without looking at her, "Don't." "Don't what?" "Let it bother you, what they're saying." She glanced at him. His profile was steady, unhurried. "Does it bother you?" "A beat." "Not anymore." She looked back at the road ahead. She didn't let it bother her. The first week was an education in tolerance. The ranch house had 3 bedrooms. Thomas had built it that way because he'd wanted children, and the children had never come, and neither of them had ever spoken about it directly. The room he'd always meant for a nursery had become a storage room. The guest room had never had a guest. Jonas took the guest room. He brought in his things from his saddlebags. Not much. A change of clothes, a shaving kit, 2 books that she noted were well worn, a gun belt that he hung on the bedpost at night. He made his own bed with the military precision of someone who had spent years with no one to do it for him. He was up before dawn every morning, which she noticed because she was up before dawn every morning, and the first time they nearly ran into each other in the dark kitchen, she had a moment of pure, startled wrongness. The shape of someone in her kitchen that wasn't Thomas's shape, the different sound of different boots on the floor. She covered it quickly. He either didn't notice or pretended not to. "Coffee," she said, moving to the stove. "I'll do it," he said. "I'm already up." They stood in the small kitchen in the dark for a moment, both having the same argument in their heads about territory and courtesy and who was conceding what. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make the coffee." He sat. He was quiet in the mornings, she discovered, and she was grateful for it. Thomas had been a talker from the moment he woke up, opinions about the weather, thoughts about whatever he'd been dreaming, plans for the day that would change twice before noon. She had loved him for it and also found it exhausting. The silence was strange in a different way, but not an unpleasant one. After the first coffee, Jonas would go out to the barn, and she would begin the household work, and they wouldn't see each other again until midday. He did what needed to be done without being asked. She found this useful and also slightly unsettling, because she kept expecting to have to explain things, and then didn't have to. At dinner, she cooked, he offered to help twice, and she said no twice, and on the third time she handed him a knife and said onions, and he chopped onions without complaint. They talked. Not much, not deeply. The condition of the north fence, the state of the cattle, whether they needed feed before the cold really set in, practical things, ranch things, nothing that required being known. Hank watched all of this from a careful distance, saying nothing, which was his particular way of saying everything. The town, of course, had opinions. Ironwood Crossing was a place with roughly 400 inhabitants and approximately 4,000 opinions, and most of them circulated through the general store, the barber shop, and the church social that happened on the 2nd and 4th Sunday of every month. Margaret had always been aware of the town's attention, but it had never been directed at her this specifically. People said Jonas Reed had killed 11 men, some said 14. Someone in the saloon apparently said 22, but that seemed like inflation. People said he'd ridden with 2 different outlaw gangs and robbed a bank in Colorado, and that the scars on his face were from a knife fight he'd started himself. What Margaret knew from talking to the federal marshal who'd passed through 2 years ago, and who had no reason to flatter anyone, was this. Jonas Reed had been a hired gun for most of his adult life, working for ranchers and rail companies as a kind of portable solution to disputes. He had killed men. The number was uncertain. He had also, according to the same marshal, refused at least 2 jobs when he found out what they actually involved, which was something. She didn't know what to do with this information. She filed it away. The women of the town were a particular challenge. Some of them were kind in the careful, delicate way that means I feel sorry for you. Some of them were simply cold. Mrs. Crane, the judge's wife, stopped speaking to Margaret entirely, which Margaret found she could live with. Clara Briggs actually crossed the street one afternoon rather than pass her on the sidewalk, which was a bit theatrical but also clarifying. The ones that surprised her were the ones who came up quietly, separately, and said things like, "My father put our land in my brother's name when my mother died. We lost it 3 years later." Or, "My grandmother had to deed everything to her son-in-law. He sold it." Or simply, "I read what Dora wrote." I think you were right. She hadn't expected that. She kept those conversations too. The moment things changed, the first time, the first small pivot, happened on a Thursday morning 11 days into the marriage. Jonas came in from the barn faster than usual. She could tell by the sound of his boots on the porch. He pushed the door open and said without preamble, "Something got into the southwest herd last night. Cattle are scattered and there's at least one dead. Looks like wolves, but I want you to look at the tracks before I say that for certain." She had her coat on before he finished the sentence. They rode out together, and she did look at the tracks, and it was wolves. A small pack, 3 or 4, working the edge of the herd where the fence had a weak spot she'd been meaning to fix. One steer was down and partially eaten. The rest had scattered across an area she'd need several hours to collect. She sent Hank and the 2 ranch hands to start rounding up the scattered cattle. She and Jonas rode the fence line, identifying the gap. "We need to close this before tonight," she said. "They'll be back." "I know. I've got the wire." They worked the fence in near silence for 2 hours. It was hard work in the cold, stiff wire, frozen ground, gloves that were never quite thick enough. Jonas worked steadily and efficiently. She had not expected him to be bad at physical work. You didn't look like him without having done considerable amounts of it. But there was something particular about the way he worked alongside her. Not in front of her, not directing, alongside. When the gap was closed, they sat on their horses in the thin afternoon light and ate the bread and hard cheese she'd thought to bring, because she was the kind of person who thought to bring food. She handed him his portion. He took it. "Thank you," he said. It was such a plain thing to say. She wasn't sure why it sat with her differently than she expected. She looked out over the fence line, at the scrubby grass and the flat gray sky beyond. "My husband used to say the land was always testing you," she said. It came out before she'd made a decision to say it. Jonas looked at her, then away. "Sounds about right," he said. They finished eating in silence, not the careful silence of 2 people managing discomfort. Something else, something that had less effort in it. She noticed that. Filed it away, too. Jake Murphy came on a Saturday. She'd known it was coming. Murphy ran a mid-sized operation 8 miles east, had decent cattle and poor judgment, and had made 2 separate attempts to court her in the year before Thomas died, both of which she'd declined without much ceremony. He had taken the declines the way men like Jake Murphy always take declines, as temporary conditions, subject to revision. He rode in with 2 of his hands, which was 3 too many for a social call. He was a big man going soft around the middle, with a face that would have been handsome 10 years ago and now just looked aggrieved. Margaret was on the porch when they came into the yard. She'd seen them coming from the North Hill and had not gone inside. "Margaret." He pulled up short of the hitching post, staying in the saddle. A dominance thing. She recognized it. "Jake," she said, "heard you had some kind of arrangement worked out." He looked around the yard like he was assessing something. "Seems like a strange business." "I expect lots of things seem strange to you." His face went a shade darker. "I want you to know," he said, shifting the reins, "that if you needed help with the property situation, there were better options available to you." "Better than what?" "Better than some drifter with a criminal record who—" "Than some drifter who what?" Jonas had appeared from the barn doorway. He was holding nothing, which was interesting. A man in his situation could have had a gun in his hand, and it would have seemed natural, but he didn't. He walked across the yard at a pace that was not fast and not slow, and stopped about 6 feet from Murphy's horse. Murphy's hands shifted in their saddles. Jonas looked up at him. He said pleasantly, "Jake Murphy, I know who you are. You've got a reputation too. Just a quieter one. Is that a fact? You've had 2 complaints filed against you at the land office in the past 4 years, both from smaller operations on your eastern border. Both cases found in your favor because both cases were heard by Judge Crane." He paused. "I find that interesting." Murphy's jaw tightened. "Who told you?" "Public record," Jonas said. Anyone can read a public record who knows where to look. He tilted his head slightly. What you came here to say is that you think Mrs. Hale made a poor choice and that you're offering a better one. I understand that. I'm going to suggest that you've delivered the message and we're done. A long moment. Murphy was calculating. She could watch it happen, could watch him measure Jonas against his two hands, against whatever he thought he knew about this situation. The calculation came out somewhere he didn't like. He put on a careful smile. Just being neighborly. Noted, Jonas said. Murphy pulled his horse around and rode back out of the yard without looking at her. His men followed. Margaret watched them go. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, she exhaled slowly. The land office records, she said. When did you look those up? Before I agreed to any of this, Jonas said. I wanted to know what I was riding into. She looked at him. I thought you just wanted somewhere to stop moving, she said. I do, he said. That doesn't mean I showed up blind. She thought about that. Then she went back inside to start dinner, and she didn't mention it again, but she was aware of having changed her mind about something, even if she couldn't quite name what it was. That night there was a thunderstorm. It came in from the northwest fast, the way storms did out here. No real warning, just a shift in the pressure of the air, and then the sky turning an ugly yellow, and then the world splitting open. The cattle would be restless. Hank would check on them. She knew that. She could hear the rain hammering the roof above her. She had come downstairs for water. She didn't sleep well during storms, and found Jonas already at the window by the kitchen table, sitting in the dark with his arms folded across the sill, looking out at the lightning. She stopped in the doorway. He didn't turn around. Couldn't sleep either. She got her water. She thought about going back upstairs. She sat down at the table instead. They watched the storm together through the window. The lightning lit up the prairie in white sheets, showing the whole landscape for half a second at a time. The fence, the barn, the flat dark plain beyond, the clouds built up like walls of something enormous. It's something, she said. Yeah. A long roll of thunder that felt like it moved through the floor. She thought about Thomas. She thought about how this chair was where he used to sit with his coffee in the morning. She thought about how grief was strange that way. Not always present and suffocating, but arriving sideways, through ordinary things, through chairs and windows, and the sound of rain on a roof. You've got good land, Jonas said quietly. She looked at him. I mean it, he said. I've covered a lot of territory in my life. This is good land, worth keeping. She didn't say anything for a moment. Yes, she said finally. It is. Another flash of lightning. She watched his face in it. The scars illuminated briefly, the tiredness around his eyes, the stillness that was starting to seem less like guardedness and more like something else. Like a man who had run a very long distance and was considering, for the first time in a long time, the possibility of stopping. She didn't think about that too hard. She said goodnight and went back upstairs, and she lay awake listening to the rain until it softened and eventually stopped. The riders arrived on a Wednesday. 4 of them, coming from the South Road, which was not the usual direction for visitors. Margaret saw them from the kitchen window and felt something cold settle in her stomach before she had a reason for it. Jonas saw them from the barn. She knew because she saw him stop working and stand very still, watching them come. And the way he went still was not the same as his ordinary stillness. It was different. It was the stillness of someone who has recognized something. She went out onto the porch. The riders pulled up in the yard. They were dressed in good clothes but hard-worn, the way men are who travel long distances and want to look like they haven't. Their leader, a thin man with a pale, unremarkable face, looked past her at Jonas, who had come out of the barn. Mr. Reed, the thin man said. The yard was very quiet. She could hear the cattle in the south pasture, small and far away. Jonas walked across the yard until he was standing beside her, not in front. Beside. Colton, he said. Mr. Morrison sent us. Something shifted in Jonas's jaw. Something small. Tell him I got the message. He'd like a conversation. He's had my answer. The thin man, Colton, let his gaze slide to Margaret and stay there for a moment. Pretty spread, he said. Be a shame if something complicated things. Look at me, Jonas said. Colton looked back at him. You tell Morrison what I said, and you tell him something came with it. His voice was level, carrying no threat in its tone, which made it worse somehow, made it more serious. He comes at this place or anyone on it, he's starting something he won't finish the way he expects to. A long moment. Colton clicked his tongue, turned his horse. The four riders went back down the south road. Margaret waited until they were out of sight. "Tell me," she said. Jonas stood beside her looking at the road. His hands were loose at his sides, but the stillness in him was the other kind now, the cold kind. "Come inside," he said. "I'll tell you." They sat at the kitchen table, where they'd watched the storm, where she'd found him in the dark. And he told her about Samuel Morrison. He told it plainly, without the kind of embellishment that men sometimes use when they're confessing something that reflects badly on them. Like the embellishment makes it more romantic and therefore less shameful. He just told it. 8 years ago, he'd been working for a ranching company as hired protection. Morrison had been acquiring land by force, and the ranching company had hired men to push back. There had been a confrontation at a disputed fence line. Morrison's son, 22 years old, reckless, and pointing a gun at an unarmed man, had been shot by Jonas. Self-defense, witnessed, legally cleared. Morrison had never accepted it. "He's a man who doesn't believe in legal," Jonas said. "He believes in his own math. His son, for whoever took his son. He's been following that math for 8 years. And you've been running." "I've been staying ahead," he said. "Not the same thing. Running means you've lost direction. I've always known where I was going. It was just—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "It was never anywhere in particular." She thought about that. "And now you're here," she said. "And now I'm here." A pause. "I'm sorry. I told you there was something. I should have told you what." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He nodded. She was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was warm. The ranch outside was quiet. She thought about what it would mean. A wealthy man with resources and a grudge, willing to apply both without legal scruple. She thought about the cattle and the fence and the barn and the house that Thomas built with the notched legs on the kitchen table. She thought, "I've already lost what I can't stand to lose. I'm not losing this too." "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right?" "All right," she said again, clearer. "So we deal with it." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, not in a way you could point to, but it changed. Like a door that had been slightly stuck being gently opened. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to." She stood up and moved to the stove. "I'm going to make more coffee, and you're going to tell me everything else you know about Samuel Morrison, and then we're going to figure out what we do next." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. It was the first time he'd said that. She noticed it in the particular way she'd been noticing things, cataloging them somewhere she hadn't quite named yet. She put the coffee on. Outside, the November wind moved through the grass in long, cold waves, and the cattle moved slowly through the early dark, and the ranch held its ground against the coming winter the way it always had, stubbornly, without much grace, and without giving an inch. The coffee grew cold before either of them finished talking. Jonas laid out what he knew about Morrison the way a man lays out tools before a difficult job. Methodically, without drama, each piece placed where it could be seen clearly. Samuel Morrison was 61 years old. He had made his first fortune in silver mining, his second in railroads, and had spent the years since building the kind of wealth that stopped needing to justify itself. He owned land across 4 territories. He had lawyers in 3 cities and hired men in every town that mattered along the western rail lines. And he had been looking for Jonas Reed for the better part of 8 years, with the particular patience of a man who understood that patience, applied correctly, was its own form of violence. "He's not going to rush," Jonas said. "That's the first thing to understand. He'll send men like Colton first. Probe the situation. See what's here, who's here, whether I've got anything worth making complicated." "And now he knows you've got a ranch," Margaret said. "He knows I've got a wife and a ranch." He said it without inflection, which means he's got more angles than he did before. She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "You think he'll use me?" "I think he'll consider it." She appreciated that he didn't soften it. She had been dealing with men who softened things for her since Thomas died, and she was profoundly tired of it. "Then we don't give him the angle," she said. "It's not always that simple." "I know it's not simple. I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking what we can do." He looked at her across the table. Something in his expression was working itself out, some internal calculation she wasn't privy to. She had the feeling he was not used to being asked what we could do, that the pronoun caught him slightly off balance. For now, he said, we watch the South Road. Anything coming from that direction, we know before it arrives. I want to talk to your foreman, Hank, about the hands. Who's reliable? Who talks too much in town? Hank's reliable. I believe you. I still want to talk to him. She nodded. In the morning. They sat for a moment longer. The fire had burned down low. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving through the eaves in that particular hollow tone that meant the temperature was dropping. You should sleep, she said. Probably. He didn't move. Jonas. He looked at her. You've been carrying this for 8 years, she said. Not unkindly. You're not going to solve it tonight. He exhaled. A long, slow thing, like something releasing pressure. No, he said. I'm not. He got up from the table, collected his cup, set it by the basin. He stopped at the doorway. Thank you, he said, for not running me off. She almost said something sharp. Something about how she'd already made a calculation about what was worth keeping and what wasn't, and he'd come out on the useful side of it. But she didn't. She just said, get some sleep, and he did. She sat alone at the table for another half hour, listening to the wind, thinking about angles. The wolf pack came back 3 nights later. She heard the cattle before the dogs started, a low, anxious sound that was different from the ordinary nighttime restlessness, and her feet were on the floor before she was fully awake. She had grown up around livestock. You learned, after long enough, to know one sound from another. She pulled on her coat over her nightgown and grabbed the rifle from beside the bedroom door without stopping to think about it. Thomas had always said she had better instincts with livestock than he did, and it was true, and she'd spent years being gracious about it because it was his ranch and his pride. She was down the stairs and out the back door when she nearly collided with Jonas coming from the other direction, already fully dressed. She had the distant thought that he probably slept that way, or close to it, with his own rifle and a lantern. South pasture, she said. I heard them. They ran. The pasture was chaos in the lantern light, cattle moving in the wrong direction, bunching badly, and at the far edge of the fence where the ground dipped toward the creek bed, she could see movement. Low, fast movement. 3 shapes, maybe 4. Jonas was faster on his feet than she expected. He covered ground the way a man covers ground who has spent years needing to move quickly, economically, without waste. He was at the fence line ahead of her, lantern up, rifle raised. The shot cracked the night open. One of the shapes dropped. The others scattered back toward the creek. Margaret was right behind him. She hit the fence running, went through the gap in the wire, cut, she noted, not broken, something to deal with in daylight, and tracked the movement of a second wolf along the fence line. It had cornered itself against the fence post, crouched, eyes lit up in the lantern like 2 bright coins. She shot it cleanly. Silence then, except for the cattle still moving and the distant creak of the barn. She stood in the cold pasture in her nightgown and coat, with her rifle lowered and her breath coming in visible clouds, and she became aware that Jonas was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. What? She said. Nothing. He turned back to scan the fence line. 2 down. I think the others went back to the creek. We'll track them in the morning. Yeah. They did a walk of the pasture fence, confirming no more gaps. 1 steer had been hit, bite wounds on its hindquarters, not mortal, but needing attention. She crouched beside it in the dark and assessed the damage with her hands while Jonas held the lantern. He'll be okay, she said. I'll need to clean the wounds at first light. All right. She stood up. They were close together in the small circle of lamplight, the pasture dark around them, the cold absolute. You're a decent shot, he said. I know. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. They walked back to the house together. At the door she stopped, suddenly aware of how she was dressed, which was to say, barely, and felt the specific discomfort of that awareness without quite knowing what to do with it. I'll make coffee, she said. Practical, safe. It's 3 a.m. I'm not going back to sleep. He considered this. Neither am I. They made coffee. They sat at the table again, the same table, and they didn't talk much. But it was different from the previous silences. The shape of it had changed. Something about having run through the same dark toward the same problem had shifted something, realigned something, in a way that neither of them commented on, because commenting on it would have required acknowledging it. Hank found the cut fence wire in the morning and said, without flourish, "That's not an accident." "No," Jonas agreed. Margaret looked at the clean-cut ends. A tool had been used, wire cutters, something sharp. "Someone opened the fence. The wolves just found the opening." "Or were driven toward it," Hank said. They looked at each other, then at the south road. "Colton?" she said. "Don't know yet," Jonas said, "but someone who wanted the wolves to do damage." She stood at the cut fence for a long moment, looking at the flat gray morning and the distant tree line. Someone had come onto her land in the night, had done it quietly, with tools, with planning. The wolves hadn't been coincidence. "Fix the fence," she said to Hank. "Double the wire this time." She turned back toward the house. "And I want to know if anyone in town's been asking questions about this property. Anyone." Hank nodded once. He didn't ask who they were worried about. He was smart enough to understand the shape of a problem without being told the name. Jake Murphy came back on a Thursday, and this time he brought 4 men and a particular kind of confidence that told Margaret he'd spent the week convincing himself that the situation was still adjustable. She was in the yard when they rode in. Jonas was on the porch. She noted and was grateful that he stayed there. Let her handle the opening of it. Murphy pulled up with more theater than last time. He was wearing a good coat and his hat was cleaner than usual. He'd dressed for something. "Margaret." He dismounted, which was different from last time, and took a step toward her. "I want to talk to you, just you." "Then you should have come alone," she said. "I thought—" "What did you think, Jake?" She kept her voice even, curious, almost. "That you'd ride in with 4 men and I'd be so relieved to see a familiar face that I'd forget why you're here." His jaw set. "I'm trying to help you." "You're trying to acquire something," she said. "You've always been trying to acquire something. The difference is now you think you've got leverage." "I've got no leverage, I've got an offer." "Your offer," Jonas said from the porch, "has been declined." Murphy turned, color rising in his face. "I'm talking to my neighbor." "You're talking to my wife," Jonas said, in the same pleasant tone he'd used last time, "who has already told you where she stands. I'm just here in case the math gets complicated." Murphy took a breath, took another. He was calculating again. Margaret could see it. And this time the calculation included the 4 men behind him and the 1 man on the porch, and whatever he thought those numbers meant. The problem for Murphy was that Jonas Reed was the kind of man who made numbers unreliable. "You're making a mistake," Murphy said to her specifically. "An appeal. When this falls apart, and it will fall apart, you'll have nothing." "She'll have the ranch," Jonas said, "which is what she started with." Murphy stared at him for a long moment. Something ugly moved through his face. "People like you don't get to settle down," he said. "Sooner or later your past walks up and knocks on whatever door you've put between you and it." Jonas stepped off the porch. 3 steps, slow. He stopped when he was close enough that Murphy would have to hold his ground or step back, and Murphy, to his credit or his foolishness, held his ground. "Jake." He said it quietly. "You've come to this property twice now, both times as a threat dressed up as something else. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think about your answer." Murphy said nothing. "Do you actually want this to become something?" Jonas said. "Because I have extensive experience with things that become something, and it doesn't go the way people imagine." A long, weighted silence. Murphy's eyes went to his men. His men were looking at the ground, at their horses, at anywhere other than Jonas Reed standing 3 feet in front of their employer. Murphy put his hat back on. He turned slowly and got on his horse. He looked at Margaret once more. Something complicated in it. Frustration and something that might have been, under other circumstances, hurt feelings, which surprised her. "You let me know," he said, "if you change your mind." "I won't," she said. He rode out. His men followed. She watched until they turned the bend in the south road and disappeared. Then she became aware that her hands were shaking slightly. Adrenaline, not fear, she knew the difference, and she pressed them flat against her thighs until they stopped. "He won't come back," Jonas said beside her. "You can't know that. I know the type." A pause. "He's not the kind to push past a clear answer. Some men need to make the offer, and when the offer is refused, they move on. Murphy's that kind." She thought about this. And Morrison's not. No, Jonas said. Morrison's not. She nodded. Walked back to the house. At the door, she stopped. You could have handled that from the porch the whole time, she said. You didn't have to come down. No, he agreed. I didn't have to. She thought about that all through dinner. She thought about it while doing the dishes, which she did alone because Jonas had gone to do the evening check on the cattle, and she needed 20 minutes of not being looked at to straighten out her own thinking. She had been married to Thomas for 11 years. She had loved him. She still loved him. That didn't just stop. And she understood marriage as a thing built slowly from ordinary proximity, from shared worry and shared meals and the particular intimacy of being seen in your worst moments and having the other person stay anyway. She was not thinking about that in relation to Jonas Reed. She was not. She just needed to understand why a man who had agreed to a functional arrangement kept doing things like stepping off the porch when he didn't need to. She didn't work it out that night. She filed it with the other things she'd been filing and went to sleep. Dora Ashby came to the ranch the following Saturday, uninvited, which was Dora's way. She arrived with her notebook and the particular energy of someone who has information she's been impatient to deliver and had finally found a reason to do it in person. She sat at the kitchen table. Everyone ended up at the kitchen table, Margaret had noticed. It was that kind of table. And she laid out what she'd found in 3 weeks of digging through land office records, railroad filings, and 2 conversations with a retired attorney who owed her a favor. The Morrison Railroad was planning a line through the Southern Territories. The optimal route, fastest, most level, best for construction, went directly through the lower quarter of the Hail property. Morrison had been quietly buying up land along the route for 2 years. Almost everything he needed was already under contract. Everything except the Hail Ranch. He can route around you, Dora said. It adds 8 miles and 2 river crossings to the project. Not impossible, but expensive enough that it changes the math considerably. Margaret looked at the map Dora spread on the table, the rail line drawn in pencil, the property boundaries marked in ink, the small rectangle that was the Hail Ranch sitting exactly where it sat. He doesn't just want Jonas, she said slowly. He wants the land. I think, Dora said carefully, he wants both. I think your husband's death, and I'm sorry to say this plainly, created an opportunity he decided to take advantage of. The room was quiet for a moment. Jonas was leaning against the wall by the doorway. He'd been there for the last 10 minutes, listening. She hadn't asked him to leave. The forced marriage, he said. The judge. Crane has a financial interest in the Morrison Railroad venture, Dora said. I found the name in a partnership filing. Small holding, but real. The shape of it assembled itself in Margaret's mind the way things do when you've had most of the pieces and the last one finally arrives. Not slowly, all at once. He put us together on purpose, she said. Crane, the marriage order. They wanted Jonas in one place where Morrison could find him, and they wanted the ranch put under legal pressure at the same time. 2 problems. 1 solution, Jonas said. Or 1 problem, Margaret said. Us. Dora was watching her with the focused expression of a journalist who knows she's in the room where the decision gets made. She closed her notebook. What are you going to do? She asked. Margaret looked at the map for a long moment, at the pencil line of the railroad, at the rectangle of the ranch. I'm going to make it harder for him, she said, starting with what you know and what you can print. Dora's expression shifted into something that was, if not quite a smile, the thing that comes just before one. She opened the notebook back up. They talked for 2 hours. By the time Dora rode back toward town, she had 3 columns of material and the beginning of a campaign that Margaret had no illusions about. It wouldn't stop Morrison directly, wasn't meant to. But it would make noise. It would put his name in print next to words like coercion and manipulation and corrupt judicial appointment, and men like Morrison, who needed their reputation the way plants need water, tended to behave differently when they felt themselves being looked at. You're going to poke a dangerous man with a newspaper, Jonas said when Dora was gone. I'm going to make him expensive, Margaret said. There's a difference. A man like Morrison doesn't do things out of pure spite. He does them when the math works out. We changed the math. He looked at her for a moment. You've thought about this kind of thing before. Thomas and I dealt with the Delaney brothers trying to buy us out for 3 years, she said. You learn what levers exist. Delaney brothers aren't Morrison. No, she said. But the principle holds. He was quiet. Then, what do you need me to do? She handed him the map. Tell me everything you know about the rail route. Anything you've heard about Morrison's operation, his partners, his timeline. Anything that might be useful to someone writing a newspaper column. He looked at the map, at the pencil line. There's more, he said, about how Morrison operates. Things I know from before. Then sit down, she said, and tell me. He sat down. It was late afternoon by the time they finished. The light had gone orange and long through the kitchen windows, laying in warm bars across the table. The map was covered in Jonas's notations, names, dates, connections she hadn't known and wouldn't have found on her own. He wrote in a cramped, careful hand, she noticed, like someone who'd learned writing later than most or had spent years being careful about what he put on paper. She was looking at the map when she became aware that the room had gone very quiet. She looked up. He was watching her. Not the way Murphy watched her, calculating, proprietary. Something else. Something that was, she thought, probably not meant to be visible. He looked back at the map immediately. She looked back at the map. We should eat, she said. Yeah, he said. Probably. She got up to start dinner, and he rolled the map carefully and set it on the shelf where it would be safe. And neither of them said anything about what had just happened, because neither of them was ready to call it what it was. But it had happened, and the ranch outside held the last of the afternoon light, and somewhere in the south pasture the cattle moved through the dry grass, and the world for one moment felt not safe exactly. It wasn't safe. They both knew it wasn't safe, but solid, like ground you could stand on. That feeling, she knew, was probably its own kind of dangerous. She put the pan on the stove. He got the plates from the shelf without being asked. They moved around the kitchen in the easy, slightly awkward way of two people learning each other's patterns without discussing it. The small, unremarkable choreography of people who are starting, despite themselves, to make room for each other. Outside, the last light died. The prairie went dark and enormous. And somewhere on the south road, though neither of them could see it yet, something was already moving. It would arrive before dawn. They came before the sky had any light in it. Margaret heard them the same way she'd heard the wolves. Something wrong in the quality of the silence, a pressure that didn't belong. She was already half awake, had been for an hour, the kind of restless, shallow sleep that comes when your body knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Then she heard the first horse. Then several. She was on her feet before the first shot cracked through the window glass downstairs. She didn't scream. She grabbed the rifle from beside her door, and she moved into the hallway, and Jonas was already there, coming from the guest room with his boots on and his gun belt buckled, like he'd been waiting for exactly this. How many? She said. Heard at least 6 horses. Maybe 8. He was already moving toward the window at the end of the hall, staying low, back to the wall. They came from the south road and split. Some went around the barn. The barn. She grabbed his arm without thinking. Hank's in the bunkhouse. I know. He looked at her. His face was very clear in the dark, very focused. I need you to stay in this house. You need me to... Margaret. He said it flat, not a request dressed up as one. There are too many of them for me to watch the house and fight at the same time. I need to know the house is covered. Can you do that? It was not stay inside because you're a woman. It was a tactical problem stated plainly. She heard the difference. Yes, she said. He went out the back. She went to the front window. The yard was chaos. 3 riders moving fast along the far fence. Gunfire coming from the direction of the bunkhouse. Hank was awake then, thank God. And from somewhere behind the barn she could see the particular orange glow that turned her stomach to ice. Fire. Someone had put fire to the barn. She thought about the horses, about the 2 good mares they'd brought in from the north pasture for the winter, stabled in there right now. She thought, I cannot stay in this house. She went out the front door low and fast, cutting along the porch shadow and then breaking for the corner of the house where the woodpile gave her cover. A rider came around the north fence and she raised the rifle and fired without hesitating, and the rider went sideways off his horse and didn't get up. She kept moving. The barn door was already burning along the top frame, not fully caught, The wood was cold and slightly damp from last week's rain, but it would be fully caught in minutes. She could hear the horses inside, that awful panicked sound they make, and she made a decision that she did not pause to evaluate. She ran for the barn. A man came out of the shadows between the barn and the tool shed. Big man, coat, hat pulled low. And he raised his gun and she dropped to one knee and shot him in the chest from close enough that she felt the impact more than hurt it, and she did not stop moving. The barn door was hot under her hands. She got it open. The hinges were on the unburned side. She had a moment of gratitude for whatever instinct had made Thomas put the hinges there, and the smoke hit her like a wall. She went in anyway. The mares were in the first two stalls. She got the first one out in 30 seconds. It didn't want to move. Horses don't move toward fire. And she had to get behind it and practically push it through the door. The second one she got a lead rope on and pulled, and the horse pulled back and she pulled harder and said things to it in a low voice she couldn't have repeated afterward. Just sound. Just, come on, come with me. And it came. She got them both out into the yard, released them toward the open pasture gate that someone, she didn't know who, she found out later it was young Dell, the youngest of Hank's hands, barely 19, had opened at some point in the chaos. The fire was eating the barn door now. She stood in the yard, out of breath, eyes burning from the smoke, and looked at it. There was nothing else to save. She'd gotten the horses. The tools and the feed were gone or going. She turned back toward the main fight. It was ending. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing. The gunfire was already less frequent, and what was left of it was concentrated near the south fence, where Jonas had taken two of Morrison's men into a bad position against the fence posts and the creek embankment. She could hear him, not words, the sound of his voice, directing something. And she could hear Hank's voice answering. She reloaded the rifle. By the time she reached the south fence, it was over. 2 men down on Morrison's side, 2 more with their hands up. The rest apparently having decided that the situation had gone significantly different from what they'd been hired for, and had taken the option of running. Jonas stood at the fence with Hank to his left and Dell to his right, and the 2 captured men were sitting on the ground with their weapons in the dirt. Jonas looked up when she came through the gate. His eyes went from her face to her hands to Oliver, quick and systematic, checking. She understood that. She did the same to him. He had a graze on his left forearm. She could see the torn sleeve and the dark stain, and he was favoring his right side slightly in a way he probably didn't know he was doing. "You went in the barn," he said. "The horses were in the barn." "I told you to stay in the house." "The horses," she said again, evenly. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Dell, who was staring at the ground trying not to be noticed. "Dell, go see what's salvageable." Dell went quickly. Hank was watching both of them with the careful neutrality he used when he was paying extremely close attention. "You're hit," she said, nodding at Jonas's arm. "Graze, it's nothing. Let me see it anyway." "It's Jonas!" He extended his arm. She pushed up the torn sleeve and looked at the wound in the early gray light. Long and shallow, already clotting, would need cleaning, but nothing deeper. She pressed her fingers along either side of it to confirm. His arm tensed under her hands, but he didn't pull away. "Clean it before you sleep," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She let go of his arm. One of the captured men cleared his throat. Margaret turned to look at him, young, scared, with the specific expression of someone who has been told a job was simple and has discovered it is not. "We're just hired," the man said. "We don't work for Morrison direct, we work for Colton." "I know," Jonas said. "Who sent you to the barn?" The man swallowed. "Colton said fire the barn, draw people out, make it fast and messy." "Where's Colton now?" The man shook his head. "He was supposed to be with the group at the north gate. I didn't see him after we split up." Jonas and Hank exchanged a look. "Find him," Jonas said to Hank. "Alive if possible." They didn't find Colton. He'd gone back up the south road before it was clear which way the fight was going. Something Jonas noted without surprise when Hank reported back. "A man who works for Morrison," he said, "learns to cut losses early. It was the only way you kept your job." The barn was badly damaged but not destroyed. The door frame was gone, one side wall had scorched and buckled, and the roof over the east end would need replacing before serious rain came. Dell and the other hands worked through the morning assessing it, while Margaret made coffee and breakfast for 6 people in her kitchen. and didn't think too much about anything, because thinking too much right then would have led somewhere she wasn't ready to go. Hank ate fast and went back out without saying much. The two hands followed him. Dell stayed long enough to eat 2 plates and look at Jonas Reed with the expression of someone who has revised his understanding of a person entirely in one night and hasn't finished processing it yet. Jonas ignored this with the practiced ease of someone used to being looked at a certain way. When it was just the two of them at the table, Margaret sat down for the first time all morning. Her hands were black with soot, and she had a long scratch on her forearm she didn't remember getting. Her coffee was too hot, but she drank it anyway. "They'll know it didn't work," she said. "Colton's probably already on his way back to report." Jonas turned his cup slowly. "Morrison will know by the time we send word to Dora." "Then we send word to Dora first." He looked at her. "She runs the paper," Margaret said. "We give her the story before Morrison can shape it. 2 of his men are dead, 2 are in custody, and he sent hired guns to burn a woman's barn in the night. Let him explain that to his railroad partners." Jonas was quiet for a moment. Then something moved through his face. Not a smile, but the older cousin of one. "You think like someone who's been in a few fights," he said. "I've been in a few fights," she said, "just not ones with guns." She wrote the letter to Dora herself, in the direct and specific language that Dora had told her once was what made a newspaper column work. Not outrage, just facts placed carefully next to each other and allowed to do their own work. On the night of November 23rd, 8 armed men entered the Hail property without invitation. 1 structure was damaged by fire. 2 men are now in the custody of the county sheriff, who has confirmed their connection to employees of Samuel Morrison, of the Morrison Rail and Land Corporation. She sent Dell with the letter and a second note for Sheriff Briggs. Not Crane's court, the actual county sheriff, who was a younger man named Webb, and who had, she'd heard, his own complicated feelings about how Crane operated. She sealed both letters and handed them to Dell and said, "Fast." Dell went fast. The town's response was not immediate, but it was more than she expected. By the end of the week, 2 things had happened that changed the shape of everything. The first was that Dora's column ran, front page above the fold, with enough specificity and sourced detail that the story got picked up by the regional paper out of Castellan, which had a readership Morrison cared about because it circulated among the men who invested in railroad ventures. The second was that Sheriff Webb came to the ranch himself and took a statement, and he did it with the seriousness of a man who understood that some things had been allowed to happen for too long in Ironwood Crossing under the administration of certain judges, and that he was making a choice about which side of that history he wanted to be on. Neither of these things solved the problem of Samuel Morrison. He was still out there, still resourced, still determined. Colton had gone back, and Morrison now knew exactly what he was dealing with. But the ground had shifted. "He'll come himself," Jonas said, 3 nights after the barn attack. They were on the porch, sitting in the cold, because the house had felt small after dinner, and neither of them had wanted to go back to their separate rooms. And somehow they'd ended up out here with coats and a lamp that was burning low. Morrison. He's the kind of man who has to close things himself. Sending hired guns was testing the perimeter. Now he knows the perimeter. He looked out at the dark. He'll come with enough men that hired guns don't matter, and he'll make it legal if he can. Some sheriff's warrant, some claim through Crane's court, something that lets him walk in the front door instead of the back. "Which is why the newspaper matters," she said. "Which is why the newspaper matters," he agreed. "It's harder to walk in the front door when people are watching." She exhaled slowly. Her breath came out white in the cold. "Are you scared?" she said. Not a challenge. An honest question. He considered it with the seriousness it deserved. "I've been scared since I was 23 years old," he said. "I stopped calling it scared. It's just something you carry." She understood that, more than she would have said. "When Thomas died," she said, and then stopped, started again. "I wasn't scared of the men trying to take the ranch. Not exactly. I was scared of what it meant, losing the last thing that was still his, the last thing that still made sense." She pulled her coat tighter. "That's the thing about grief. It turns everything else into a kind of proxy war." He looked at her. It was dark enough that she couldn't read his expression clearly, just the shape of him turned toward her. "Is it still that?" he said carefully. "A proxy war?" She thought about it honestly. "Partly," she said. "But It's becoming something else, too. She said it without looking at him, looking at the dark prairie instead, at the black shape of the grass against the slightly less black sky. The silence that followed had weight in it, a specific, careful weight. "Margaret," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression he'd been carefully not showing her for weeks. She recognized it now. The shape of it, the particular kind of effort that had been going into keeping it put away. It was not a practiced expression. It was the opposite. It was what happened when a man ran out of practice. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right." "I didn't agree to this arrangement because I needed somewhere to stop." He said it slowly, like he was working through it in real time. "That was true when I said it. It stopped being the whole truth somewhere around the second week." She didn't say anything. I'm not telling you that, so you have to do something about it," he said. "I understand what this is, what we agreed to. He stopped, started over. "I've spent 8 years not telling people things because telling people things gave Morrison ammunition. I'm tired of not saying what's true." She looked at him for a long moment. "What is true?" she said. "A beat. That I'm not indifferent," he said, "to you, to any of it. That this place feels like something I didn't know still existed." He looked away, back at her. "That's all." The lamp between them flickered in a breath of cold wind. She thought about Thomas. She thought about 11 years and notched table legs and a dentist appointment that would never happen. She thought about how grief was not a door you walked through and left behind. It was more like a room you learned to live in, and then one day you noticed you'd moved some furniture around, made space for something else. And that wasn't betrayal. That was just life being longer than loss. She reached out and put her hand over his on the arm of the chair. Not a declaration, just a fact. He looked down at her hand, then at her. "Okay," she said. It was not a big word for what it covered, but it was the true one. He turned his hand over, slowly, and closed his fingers around hers. They sat like that in the cold and the dark for a long while, not saying anything else, because nothing else needed saying tonight. The lamp burned down to nothing before they went inside. They stood in the hallway at the top of the stairs, the familiar branching point where every night for weeks they had gone to their separate rooms without discussion. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She went to her room. He went to his. It was not nothing, what had happened on the porch. It was not everything either. It was something in the middle, which was exactly where real things lived. In the middle, uncertain, unresolved, growing in the dark like something that needed weather to prove what it was made of. 3 days later, Dora sent word that Samuel Morrison had boarded a train heading west. He was coming personally. Margaret read the note at the kitchen table while Jonas stood by the window. She set it down flat on the wood. "How long?" she said. 4 days? Maybe 5? He didn't turn from the window. Outside, Hank was moving the cattle to the north pasture, a precaution they'd agreed on, getting the herd away from the south road. "Depends on what he's bringing with him." "He'll bring enough," she said. "Yes." She folded the note carefully along its original lines. She thought about the ranch, about the damaged barn and the rebuilt fence and the new wire on the south pasture, about the horses she'd pulled from the fire and the 2 hands Morrison's men had almost killed, and Hank's face in the early gray morning after the attack, checking each person to make sure they were whole. She thought about Jonas on the porch 2 nights ago, saying, "I'm tired of not saying what's true." She thought about what was worth protecting. She thought about what she was willing to do for it. "I want to meet him," she said. Jonas turned from the window. "What?" "Morrison, when he arrives." She looked at Jonas steadily. "Not with guns. First, I want to talk to him before anything else happens." "Margaret, I have leverage he doesn't know I have," she said. "Dora's articles. The railroad investors who've read them. The county sheriff who's already opened a file on the barn incident. Morrison is a man who cares about his business reputation. I want to use that before we use anything else." He looked at her for a long moment. "If he comes with 30 armed men, then we have 30 armed men's worth of problem and we deal with it," she said. "But if there's a version where I can make the math work in a room instead of a battlefield, I want to try it first." He said nothing for a moment. She could see him working through it. the tactical part of him, the careful, experienced part that had kept him alive for 8 years against a man like Morrison. He won't negotiate in good faith, Jonas said. I know. But he might negotiate. She held his gaze. And sometimes that's enough. He exhaled, a slow, reluctant sound. All right, he said. We plan for both. She nodded. She got up and went to the shelf where Jonas had put the map, his careful handwriting all over it, the names and connections and timelines he'd given her the night Dora came. She spread it on the table. He came and stood beside her. They got to work. Outside, the November sky was pressing down flat and gray and cold over the ranch, and somewhere on the western rail line, a man with money and a grudge was moving toward them with everything he had, and the land that Thomas Hale had built from nothing and that Margaret Hail had refused to surrender sat solid and stubborn under the winter sky. Waiting. Morrison arrived on a Thursday, which was somehow appropriate. Nothing good ever seemed to happen on Thursdays. Margaret saw the dust from the north ridge before Hank called up to the house. A long plume of it, the kind that meant more than a few horses. She was already on the porch with her coat on when Jonas came out behind her. How many? She said. He shaded his eyes. 20 at least, maybe more behind the tree line. 20. She had planned for 15 and hoped for 10 and told herself she could manage 20. She was not entirely certain that was true, but she had committed to the position and she was not going to revise it now. Stay back, she said to Jonas. Margaret, not because I don't trust you, because he came here for you. If I'm the one standing in the yard when he rides in, it changes what he thinks he's walking into. She looked at him directly. Please. A pause. His jaw was set in the way it got when he disagreed with something and was calculating whether disagreement was the right call. She watched him decide. I'll be at the barn, he said. 15 feet. One word and I'm there. 15 feet is fine. He went to the barn. She stayed on the porch. Morrison rode in at the front of his column like a man who had done this before and expected a specific kind of reception. He was older than she'd imagined from Jonas's description, not old exactly, but worn in the particular way that comes from decades of getting what you want and finding out it costs more than expected. He had white hair under a dark hat and a face that might have been handsome once and was now just commanding, the way a cliff face is commanding. Something hard and permanent about it. He pulled up in her yard with 23 men behind him. She counted, and he looked at her on the porch for a moment without speaking, like he was reading something. Then he said, Mrs. Hale. Mr. Morrison, she said, you've come a long way. I have. Then you should come inside, she said, and we should talk. He looked at the barn. He knew Jonas was there. Of course he knew. He'd come prepared for Jonas. But something in her posture or her tone, or simply the unexpected quality of the invitation made him pause. Just you, he said. Just me and you, she agreed. Your men can wait in the yard. Mine will stay at the fence. She paused. I have coffee, and I have some things I think you should read before this goes any further. He considered this for long enough that she thought he might say no. Then he dismounted, handed his reins to the man nearest him, and walked toward the porch. She held the door open. He went in. She had set the kitchen table deliberately. The map was there, with Morrison's own rail route drawn across it in pencil. Beside it, Dora's 3 published columns, folded open, not rolled, so the headlines were visible. And beside those, a handwritten letter that she had worked on for 2 days and then rewritten twice more. He sat down. He looked at the table. He picked up the first column and read it without expression. She poured coffee, set his cup in front of him, sat across from him. He read all 3 columns. He read the letter. He set it down and looked at her. You've been busy, he said. I've been protecting what's mine, she said. Same as you. Something flickered in his eyes. Not respect exactly. Recognition. You know what I'm here for, he said. I know what you think you're here for, she said. I want to show you what it actually costs. She turned the map toward him. Your rail route needs this land. The alternate route adds 8 miles and 2 crossings and costs you, I had a railroad engineer in Castellan run the estimate, somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 in additional construction, plus the delay. She paused. Your current investors have already read Dora's column. I know because two of them wrote letters to the Castellan paper in response, both of which Dora has in hand and will publish next week unless something changes. Morrison looked at the map. His face gave away nothing but his hands, she noticed, had gone very still on the table. You're threatening me, he said. I'm describing a situation, she said. Threatening you would look different. And what does the situation look like? The situation looks like this. She kept her voice level and her eyes on him. You've spent 8 years and a considerable amount of money hunting one man. In that time, the man you're hunting has committed no crime you can prove in a court that isn't already in your pocket. My county sheriff, not Crane, Webb, has an open investigation into the attack on my property 3 weeks ago. 2 of your employees are in county custody. That investigation leads places you don't want it to lead. She folded her hands. Or, you take a fair price for a land easement through the southwest corner of this property, which is what you actually need. Not the whole ranch, just the route. And you walk away from Jonas Reed, permanently and in writing. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the horses moving in the yard, the low sound of men waiting. He killed my son, Morrison said. It came out different from everything else he'd said. Quieter. The hard surface cracked just slightly, and underneath it was something she recognized. Grief wearing the wrong clothes, grief that had been walking around in anger's coat for so long, it had forgotten what it was originally. She looked at him. I know, she said. And then, because she was not going to lie to him, and she was not going to be unkind either, she said, I lost my husband 4 months ago. I know what it is to sit with a loss that doesn't have anywhere to go. She paused. But you've been pointing that loss at someone for 8 years, and it hasn't made it smaller, has it? Something moved through his face, just briefly, just once. He looked at the map. He picked up his coffee, drank it, set the cup down. The southwest easement, he said. What are the terms? She had the terms already written. She slid them across the table. He read them slowly. She watched him read them the way she'd watched the sky on the morning of the barn attack, looking for what was coming, reading the signs. The clause about Reed, he said. Permanent withdrawal of all pursuit, private and legal. That's a broad commitment. It's the only version I'm offering. Another long silence. Your lawyers will tell you what the Castellan investors will tell you, she said, that this is the cleaner option. He set the paper down. He looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough that she started running contingency calculations in the back of her mind. Jonas at the barn, Hank at the fence, Webb's open investigation, Dora with 3 more columns ready to print. All right, Morrison said. She did not let the relief show on her face. She had learned, sitting across from men in rooms like this, that relief was a kind of weakness, and weakness was an invitation. We'll need a notary, she said. I can have one here by tomorrow morning. I have a lawyer with me. I'll have Webb here too, she said. As a witness. He looked at her steadily. You don't trust me. I trust the paper, she said. Same as you. He almost smiled. It didn't make it all the way, but she saw where it was going. You're not what I expected, he said. No, she said. I imagine not. She showed him out. He went back to his men, said something to the man nearest him, and the column began reorganizing itself, setting up a temporary camp at the south end of the property. Morrison having apparently decided that the negotiation being complete in principle, there was no point in the theater of riding away and coming back. Jonas was at her elbow before she fully reached the porch. Well, he said. He agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Something went through his face that was complicated enough that she couldn't name all of it. Relief was part of it. Disbelief, maybe. Something else underneath both. You did that, he said. We did it, she said. The map was yours. He shook his head slightly, not disagreeing. Something else. What? She said. Nothing. He looked at the yard, at Morrison's men settling in. Nothing. You should know. I've been expecting this to end badly for 8 years. I've been carrying that expectation like it was a fact. It's not a fact yet. No, he said. Not yet. The documents were signed the next morning, with Webb and Morrison's lawyer both present, and Dora, who had ridden out at 5 in the morning because she was not going to miss this, sitting in the corner of the kitchen taking notes with the quiet intensity of someone who knows when history is happening in a small room. Morrison signed without ceremony and left without looking at Jonas. Jonas stood by the barn door and watched him go, and his face was very still in that particular way. The old way, the cold kind. Margaret stood beside him. 8 years, he said quietly, not to her specifically, just out loud. Over, she said. He exhaled. A long, slow thing, like something coming out of him that had been in there a very long time. Yeah, he said. Over. She put her hand on his arm, briefly, and went back inside to thank Webb and pour Dora more coffee. The town of Ironwood Crossing did not receive the news of Morrison's departure and the signed agreement with universal enthusiasm. Some people, the Delaney brothers, Mrs. Crane, a contingent of the church social regulars who had decided opinions about the fitness of Jonas Reed for decent society, received it with the specific displeasure of people who had been counting on a different outcome. Margaret heard, through Dora, that Clara Briggs had described the whole situation as unseemly, which was rich considering her husband's financial connection to Crane's court. But some people had the gift of selective indignation. The harder thing was the town meeting. It happened 3 weeks after Morrison left, called by the town council ostensibly to discuss road improvements, but actually, everyone understood this, to discuss the Hail situation. Margaret had known it was coming and had thought about not attending, and then had thought harder about what not attending would mean, and went. She went with Jonas. They walked into the meeting hall together, and the quality of the room changed when they entered in the particular way it does when people have been talking about you and you have arrived in the middle of it. 50 people at least. She recognized most of them. Some of them she'd known for a decade. Briggs chaired the meeting. He got through the road business in 15 minutes and then cleared his throat in the way that meant he was coming to the real subject. There's been some concern expressed, he said carefully, about the situation at the Hail property. Specifically, there are residents who feel that, given the nature of the arrangement made in November, the question of the property's legal standing going forward warrants some discussion. Margaret raised her hand. Briggs, surprised, recognized her. She stood. I'll make this simple, she said, addressing the room rather than the chair. The arrangement made in November, made, I'll remind everyone, under a legal provision that this council saw fit to apply 3 days after my husband's funeral, is no longer just a functional arrangement. She paused. Let that sit. Jonas Reed is my husband in every sense of the word. The Morrison matter is resolved. The property is secure. And I'd like everyone in this room to understand that whatever was said about this situation behind closed doors, I'm prepared to have any part of it said to my face. Silence. Furthermore, she said, I'd like to note that the legal provision used to compel this marriage has been formally challenged in a petition I filed with the territorial court last week. Dora's been kind enough to cover that too. She looked at Briggs directly. And I'd like to note that Councilman Briggs and Judge Crane's financial connection to the Morrison Railroad venture is a matter of public record, and that Sheriff Webb is aware of it. Briggs had gone a specific shade of red. From the back of the room, someone started to say something. Margaret turned toward the voice. It was Clara Briggs. Her face was rigid. You brought a dangerous man into this community. I brought a man into my home who kept hired gunmen from burning my barn to the ground, Margaret said. If that's dangerous, I'll take it. Someone in the room laughed. Just one person, quickly suppressed. But it was there. Every woman in this room, Margaret said, and her voice had changed, quieter now, but carrying differently, knows what it means to have men decide what's appropriate for her. Every woman in this room knows what it costs to push back against that. She looked around the room slowly. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm telling you where I stand. She sat down. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes and resolved nothing, which was its own kind of resolution. Afterward, in the street outside, 3 women came up to her separately and quietly said things she kept. One of them was a rancher's wife from the North End who had never spoken to her before. One of them was the schoolteacher, Miss Vance, who shook her hand with both of hers and didn't say anything at all, just held on for a moment. Jonas had stood against the back wall the whole meeting. On the walk home, he didn't say much. You didn't have to do that, he said eventually. I know. You put yourself in the middle of it. I was already in the middle of it, she said. I just stopped pretending to be at the edge. He was quiet for a while. The road back to the ranch was cold and the stars were out in that excessive winter way they had, too many of them, spread across the black like someone had been careless with a handful of salt. "Margaret," he said. She looked at him. "I love you," he said. Said it the way he said most things, plainly, without ceremony, like a fact being stated because it was true, and he was done not saying true things. "I know that's—" He stopped. "I know it might be too soon or too much, or—" "Jonas," she said. He stopped. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I've known for a while," she said. "I just wasn't ready to say it back yet." She held his gaze in the dark. "I'm not there yet. Not all the way. But I'm—" She thought about how to say it honestly. "I'm moving in that direction, and I wanted you to know that." He nodded, slowly. The way you nod when you're absorbing something that's better than you expected, and you don't want to say the wrong thing and ruin it. "That's enough," he said. "Good," she said. They walked the rest of the way home without saying much, the cold moving in around them, and it was good. It was the particular goodness of two people who are not performing anything for each other. Not happiness, not normalcy, not a version of themselves they think is more acceptable. Just walking, just the road and the cold and the stars and the space between them that had, at some point in the past weeks, stopped being empty. They were a week into December when the federal marshal arrived. He came alone, which meant what he had to say was not an arrest. His name was Garrett, and he had the weathered, functional face of a man who spent most of his life moving between places and had given up expecting any of them to be comfortable. He sat at the kitchen table, always the kitchen table, and he looked at Jonas with the expression of a man who has news he's been carrying a while and is not certain how it will land. "I need to tell you something," Garrett said, "about your sister." The room went very still. Jonas sat across from him. His face had gone careful in a specific way Margaret hadn't seen before. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing threat, but something rawer than that, something he didn't have armor for. "Sarah's dead," Jonas said. It came out flat. Stated before it could be confirmed, the way people do when they've already made peace with the worst version and can't stand the hope of any other. "No," Garrett said. Jonas said nothing. "She's alive," Garrett said. "She's in a settlement called Millhaven, about 40 miles east of here. She's been there for, we think, about 4 years." He paused. "Morrison had her. He kept her alive because a dead sister was less useful to him than a living one. She was—" He chose his words carefully. "She was contained. She's free now. Morrison's settlement voided the arrangement he'd used to hold her." The kitchen was very quiet. Jonas's hands were flat on the table. Margaret could see that he was working to keep them flat, to keep everything in his face from doing what it wanted to do. "She's alive," he said, like testing it. "She's alive," Garrett said. "She's asking for you." Margaret watched Jonas close his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, watched him open them, watched him exhale through his nose. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at it, then at her. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't make it smaller. Garrett cleared his throat gently and looked at his coffee. It was later, after Garrett had been given a room for the night and the house had settled into its evening quiet, that Jonas sat on the porch steps with his coat unbuttoned despite the cold, and Margaret sat beside him and they both looked out at the dark ranch. "She was 19 when he took her," Jonas said. "I thought—" He stopped. "There was a grave, with her name on it. Morrison had a grave made with a stone." "He wanted you to stop looking," Margaret said. "It worked." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Specifically, bad. "I stopped looking. 3 years I looked, and then I stopped." "You had no way to know." "I stopped," he said again. She understood that he needed to say it, that the guilt was going to be part of this no matter what she said, and the right thing was not to argue with it, but to let him say it and be there while he did. "She's alive," Margaret said. "That's what's true now." He was quiet for a long time. "I need to go to her," he said. "Of course." "I don't know what condition—" He stopped. "I don't know what 4 years with Morrison's people did to her." "Then you go and you find out," she said. "And then you bring her here." He turned to look at her. Here, he said. This is your home, she said. Simply. Like it wasn't a complicated thing to say, even though they both understood it was. Both of you. Something in his face went through a change that she didn't have a word for. It wasn't happiness exactly. Too complicated for that. Too many things in it. But it was something real, and it was directed at her, and it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. Margaret, he said. Don't, she said. Not unkindly. Don't thank me. Just come back. He nodded. He left the next morning with Garrett. Margaret stood on the porch in the cold and watched him ride out, and it was different from every other time she'd watched someone ride away from this ranch. Different, because he was coming back. She knew he was coming back, and she had told him to, and he would. She went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the map still on the shelf and the signed documents in the drawer and the scratch on her arm from the barn fire that was almost healed and all the ordinary evidence of a life that had become, without her entirely intending it, something she wanted to keep. The realization that she was happy, not simply surviving, not simply managing, but actually, genuinely, in the middle of something good, arrived like most true things do. Not as a dramatic moment, just quietly, over coffee, on a cold December morning. She sat with it. Outside, Hank was moving the cattle back to the south pasture. Dell was working on the barn wall. The ranch was alive and working in hers. She drank her coffee. She let herself feel it. Somewhere east, Jonas was riding toward his sister, and in 4 days, or 5, he would turn around and ride back. She would be here. She would be exactly here. He was gone 6 days. Margaret counted them the way she counted things she didn't want to admit she was counting, without making a point of it, without marking a calendar, just aware in the back of her mind of the number turning over each morning when she woke and found the guest room door still open and the room inside still empty. She kept busy. The barn wall was almost finished, and she worked alongside Dell and the other hands for 2 full days, until Hank told her, with the particular gentleness he used when he was actually being firm, that she was going to work herself into the ground and that the barn would still be there if she took an afternoon. She ignored him and kept working because the alternative was sitting in the kitchen with her thoughts, and her thoughts had gotten complicated. She thought about what Garrett had told them, about Morrison keeping Sarah Reed alive as a tool, a way to control Jonas emotionally, to keep him off balance, to give himself leverage he never had to use because Jonas didn't know it existed. 4 years in a settlement 40 miles east, technically free to move but watched, dependent, with the kind of invisible walls that don't need bars to hold. She thought about a man spending 8 years running from the same person who held his sister captive and didn't know it. The particular cruelty of that, the specific design of it. She thought, Morrison let Jonas grieve a person who was still alive. He made a grave and put her name on it and let a brother carry that for years. And then she thought about sitting across from that man in her kitchen and making a business deal with him. About the moment she'd seen something in his face that she'd identified as grief wearing the wrong clothes. About being almost right, almost sympathetic, and being glad she hadn't softened more than she had. She was on the porch on the evening of the 6th day when she saw the dust from the east road. 2 riders. She knew the shape of the first one before she could see his face. She stayed on the porch. She didn't go running down to the yard because she was a grown woman and not a person who ran toward things if she could receive them with dignity. But she stood up from the chair and she put her hands in her coat pockets, and she was standing there squarely when Jonas rode into the yard. He looked tired. Not the old tired. Not the 8 years of running tired she'd learned to recognize in the set of his shoulders. A different kind. The kind that comes from feeling something very large in a short amount of time and not yet knowing where to put it. The woman riding beside him was small, dark-haired like her brother, with a face that was younger than it looked. 23 years old and carrying more than that in her eyes. She sat her horse well enough and looked at the ranch with the careful expression of someone assessing whether a place is safe, not dangerous. Careful, but the automatic bone-deep wariness of a person who has learned to read environments for threat. Margaret recognized that too. Jonas dismounted. He looked at Margaret on the porch for a moment. "We made it," he said. "I can see that," she said. "Come in, both of you. There's food." Sarah Reed, she was still Sarah Reed, had held on to the name through everything, which Margaret found out later and thought was exactly the right kind of stubborn, ate 2 full plates at the kitchen table and didn't say much. She watched Margaret the way a person watches someone they've been told things about and are now measuring against the telling. Margaret didn't push. She refilled the bread plate and kept the coffee coming and let the girl find her own pace. Jonas ate like a man who hadn't stopped long enough to eat properly in 6 days, which was probably accurate. After dinner, when Dell had shown Sarah to the room they'd made up, the old nursery, cleared out at last, which felt like the right use for it, Jonas sat at the table with his 3rd coffee, and Margaret sat across from him, and they were quiet for a while. "How is she?" Margaret said. "Angry," he said. "Mostly angry. He thought about it. "She's intact, that's the right word. She didn't break, but she's angry, and she's got a right to be, and I think it's going to take her a while to know what to do with it." "Anger's honest," Margaret said. "Yeah." He turned his cup. "She asked about you, on the ride back." "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth." He looked at her steadily. "That you were the most formidable person I'd met in my life, and that I was still figuring out how I'd gotten lucky enough to be sitting at your table." She felt something warm move through her chest that she didn't try to analyze. "That's not what you said." "It's what I meant." "Jonas, I also might have said something about the barn," he said. "The fire. Her running in." The corner of his mouth moved. "Sarah said it sounded like something she'd do." Margaret thought about this small, angry, intact young woman who'd held onto her name through 4 years of someone trying to make her into a tool. "I think I'm going to like her," she said. "She's difficult." "Good," Margaret said. This family needed more difficult women. He looked at her when she said this family, and she looked back at him, and neither of them made a point of it. 2 weeks later, everything that had been settled came unsettled in the space of one afternoon. Garrett came back. He came alone again, which should have been reassuring and wasn't, because his face had the specific tight quality of a man who has information he didn't want to have and isn't sure how it's going to be received. He sat at the kitchen table, Jonas and Margaret across from him, Sarah in the doorway, having refused to be told the room twice, and he put a folded document on the table and left his hand on it. "Morrison didn't sign what you thought he signed," Garrett said. Margaret's stomach went cold. "The easement clause was legitimate," Garrett said quickly. "The land agreement stands. It's the other clause. The withdrawal from pursuit of Jonas Reed." He opened the document. His lawyer, and Morrison knew this when he signed, inserted a narrowing provision in the language. Private withdrawal of direct pursuit. Not his agents, not third parties acting on prior authorization. He paused. "It means Morrison honored the letter of it. He's not coming himself, but there are men, already paid, already understanding orders from before the signing, who aren't covered by the agreement." The kitchen was very quiet. "How many?" Jonas said. "We think 3, maybe 4. They were already in the territory when Morrison signed, but he may have signed specifically because he knew they were already in motion. The agreement gave him cover." Garrett's voice was professionally neutral, but his eyes weren't. "I'm sorry, I should have caught the language." "Where are they?" Jonas said. "Last confirmed position was 2 days ago. Serpent's Canyon, about 12 miles southwest." He looked at Margaret. "They're waiting for something. We think they're waiting for Jonas to be away from the property, away from backup." Margaret looked at the map on the shelf. She knew Serpent's Canyon. Everyone in the territory did. A long cut through the rock where the walls came close, and the sound echoed, and you could hold a position against twice your numbers if you knew what you were doing. "You have marshals?" she said to Garrett. 3 with me. I can send for more, but it takes time we may not have." She looked at Jonas. He was already somewhere else in his head. She could see it, the shift in his eyes, the way he was running through it. "No," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever you're thinking," she said. "No." "Margaret, you're thinking about going out there alone," she said, "using yourself as the target, drawing them out." A pause, not a denial. "It's the cleanest option," he said. "If they're waiting for me away from the property, I give them what they're waiting for. Garrett's men can, and if Garrett's 3 men aren't enough, if there are 4 of them and something goes wrong," she kept her voice steady, but it cost her. "You don't get to make that decision alone. It's my problem." "It became my problem," she said, The day I signed those documents at the courthouse. We have been over this. We are in this together, or we are not in it at all." He looked at her, at Garrett, at Sarah in the doorway, who was watching with her arms crossed, and an expression that said she was firmly on Margaret's side of this argument without having been asked. "She's right," Sarah said flatly. "Don't be an idiot." He pressed his mouth together. "We plan it properly," Margaret said. "All of us. Together." They planned it at the kitchen table on the map, with Garrett laying out what he knew about the canyon terrain, and Jonas adding what he knew about how men like this operated, and Margaret asking the questions that nobody else thought to ask because she had spent 12 years running a cattle operation and understood logistics in a way that gunfighters sometimes didn't. The plan was not clean or simple. Real plans never were. But it was solid, and it accounted for the things that could go wrong, and it gave everyone a role that used what they actually had rather than what they wished they had. Jonas would ride into the canyon. He would not be alone. Dell would be 200 yards back on the East Ridge, which he'd hunted since he was a boy, and could navigate blind. Hank would hold the south approach. Garrett's 3 marshals would take the canyon entrance. Margaret would be on the West Ridge with a rifle and a clear line of sight to the canyon floor. "You're not a marshal," Garrett said to her. "No," she agreed. "I'm better. I know this land." Garrett looked at Jonas. Jonas said, "Don't look at me. I stopped arguing with her weeks ago." They rode out before dawn. The cold was absolute, the deep, dry cold of a territory winter that gets into everything and doesn't apologize for it. The horse's breath came in white clouds. The stars were still out, going pale at the eastern edge as the sky began its slow business of becoming morning. Margaret rode the West Ridge approach alone, which she'd insisted on because the path was narrow and 2 horses would have made noise, and she needed to arrive before the light gave her away. She knew the ridge. She'd ridden it with Thomas in the first year when they were learning the land that surrounded what they'd bought. She found her position, a flat shelf of rock behind a scrub juniper that gave her cover and a view of the canyon floor 40 feet below, and she settled in and she waited. Waiting is its own kind of courage. People don't talk about it that way because it's not dramatic, but lying still on cold rock with your hands on a rifle and your heart doing something irregular in your chest while you watch the sky get light requires something. She had it. She had developed it over months of a different kind of waiting, waiting for grief to ease, waiting for a situation to resolve, waiting for herself to know what she wanted. She heard Jonas enter the canyon before she saw him, the sound of a single horse on rock, unhurried, deliberate. He came into her view below her, small from this distance, one man on a horse in a canyon in the early morning, and he stopped in the open space at the canyon's widest point and he waited. It didn't take long. They came from the north end, which was the angle Jonas had predicted and Garrett's men had planned for. 3 of them. 1 fewer than the worst estimate, which was something. They spread out as they came, which meant they'd done this before, meant they weren't panicking, meant they were professionals. Margaret identified the one with the best position, rightmost, angling to cut off the south exit, and she put her eye to the rifle. Below, Jonas's voice carried up through the canyon acoustics, strange and close. "Colton send you?" The lead man said something she couldn't fully hear. "Morrison's arrangement is settled," Jonas said. "I don't know if he told you that." "Don't matter," the lead man said, audible now. "Standing order." "All right," Jonas said. And then, without any more conversation, because he'd said what he needed to say and given Garrett's men the moment they needed to get into position, he dropped sideways off his horse. Everything happened at once. Garrett's men came from the canyon entrance. Dell fired from the East Ridge. Margaret put her shot into the rightmost man before he finished raising his rifle and didn't watch him fall because she was already moving to the next position. The second man took cover behind a rock outcrop and traded shots with Garrett's position for what felt like a long time and was probably 40 seconds. The lead man had his horse between him and the canyon walls and was maneuvering fast, looking for a line, and Margaret tracked him along the ridge and waited for the angle. Jonas was on foot, moving along the canyon wall, staying in the shadow, and she could see him and the lead man couldn't, and she tracked the lead man and waited, and Jonas came around the outcrop edge. And there was a moment, a very specific moment, the kind that gets burned and permanent, where the lead man turned and found Jonas 3 feet from him and made a decision that was the wrong decision, and Jonas made a decision that was faster. The shot echoed off of the canyon walls and went on echoing. Silence. Margaret stayed on the ridge for another full minute, scanning the canyon floor, the approach, the exit. Nothing moving that shouldn't be moving. "Clear," Garrett's voice came up from below. She let herself breathe. Her hands were shaking. They hadn't shaken during that was how the body worked sometimes, holding it together until it was over and then presenting the bill. She set the rifle down and pressed her palms flat against the cold rock and breathed. Then she picked up the rifle and went down to the canyon floor. Jonas was standing near the center of the open space, looking at something on the ground that she didn't look at. Garrett was doing the necessary procedural things that marshals did. Dell was coming down from the east ridge with his horse. She walked to Jonas. He looked up when she got close. He looked her over the way he always did. Systematic, checking. His eyes stopped at her hands. "You're shaking," he said. "I know." "Are you hit?" "No. Are you?" "No." They looked at each other in the gray morning light, in the bottom of a canyon with the echoes of gunfire still fading and the cold absolute around them. She put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, feeling it beat. Something she hadn't let herself do before now. He covered her hand with his, pressing it there. "It's over," she said. "It's over," he said. Not clean, not triumphant, just true. The ride back was quiet. Garrett and his men handled the legal aftermath, the paperwork, the notifications, the necessary communications to the territorial authority that would close the file on Samuel Morrison's standing operations permanently, the man himself having signed documents that were now being used to establish the scope of his culpability. Dora ran 3 more columns. The Morrison Railroad and Land Corporation restructured twice in the following 6 months, and eventually the investors Margaret had identified divested, which was not justice exactly, but was the kind of consequence that meant something in the language men like Morrison actually spoke. Judge Crane retired suddenly in February, the retirement assisted by the documentation Sheriff Webb had been quietly assembling. Webb got a commendation from the territorial court. He was embarrassed by it in the specific way of people who did the right thing because it was right and not because they expected credit. The barn got rebuilt. Properly this time, Jonas and Hank and Dell worked on it for 3 weeks, and it came out better than the original, which was the only good thing the fire had done. Sarah was difficult, as advertised, and Margaret liked her immediately and thoroughly. She was sharp and quick-humored and carried her anger the way some people carry useful tools. Not always visibly, but always accessible. She cried once, in the kitchen, alone, and Margaret came in and found her and sat down across from her without saying anything, and they stayed like that until it passed. And Sarah never mentioned it, and neither did Margaret. And that was the beginning of something that didn't have a clean name, but was real. Sarah started working with the horses. She had a way with them that Jonas said she'd always had, even as a kid. A patience that didn't look like patience, more like genuine interest in what the animal was thinking. By spring, she was helping manage the herd rotation and arguing with Hank about fence placement with the confidence of someone who had been there for years. The town came around as towns do, slowly and without announcement. Not everyone. There were people in Ironwood Crossing who would always think what they thought about Jonas Reed and a widow who moved too fast, and a marriage that started wrong and ended strange. That was fine. Margaret had stopped requiring unanimous approval sometime around October, and found that life was considerably more manageable without that particular need. The people who mattered said what they said quietly, in passing, the way the truth usually travels. The schoolteacher, Miss Vance, who started having coffee with Margaret on the first Tuesday of each month, which became a fixed thing. Dora, who was just Dora, present, ink-stained, relentless, and loyal in the way that only people who write things down truly understand loyalty. Hank, who never said much but whose continued presence every morning was its own kind of statement. Dell, who grew up considerably that winter and came out the other side of it a different kind of young. The marriage changed. Not in a dramatic moment, not in a single conversation. It changed the way the season changes. Incrementally, without any one day you could point to and say there, that was when it happened. But it happened. They shared the kitchen in the mornings without the careful choreography of 2 strangers managing proximity. They argued, sometimes, about the cattle, about decisions, about the right way to approach a problem. And the arguments were real arguments between two people who respected each other enough to disagree out loud, and they ended the way real arguments between people who know each other end. Sometimes with one person being right, sometimes with both people being partially right, occasionally with both of them being wrong in ways that were at least instructive. She told him about Thomas. Not all at once, in pieces, over months, the way you share a person who is gone, a story here, a detail there. The notched table legs one evening when he asked about them. He listened the way he did most things, fully, without rushing her toward a conclusion. He understood. She thought he understood, from his own version of carrying someone gone, that the telling wasn't a closing, but a keeping. He told her things she hadn't asked about. The years before Morrison, a woman in a town he didn't name who had been good to him and who he'd left anyway because staying felt impossible at the time, which he said with the particular quiet regret of someone who knows they were wrong about something and has sat with that knowledge long enough to simply report it. A brother he'd had who died young before any of the rest of it. Small things, real things. The guest room stopped being his room sometime in late January, quietly, without a formal declaration, because formal declarations were not the way either of them operated. She woke up one morning and he was there, and it was simply true, the way things that have been becoming something for a long time are finally just that thing. In March, she asked him to marry her again. She did it at breakfast, over coffee, which was where all the real things in their lives had happened. "I want to do it again," she said. He looked up from his cup. "Do what again?" "Get married." She held his gaze. "The first time was a courthouse and 8 minutes, and neither of us chose it. I want to choose it." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she'd learned to read, the one that looked like stillness and was actually him moving very fast internally, taking something in. "All right," he said. "That's it? All right? What else do you want me to say?" "I don't know, something more than all right." He thought about it. "Yes," he said. "Obviously, yes. I loved you before I had any business loving you, and I've been here every day since waiting for you to catch up." He paused. "All right?" She laughed. Actually laughed. The real kind. The kind she had not expected to have access to again so soon. "All right," she said. The second wedding happened on an April morning when the weather had finally broken and the prairie was doing what it did in spring. Tentative green pushing up through the brown, the light changing quality, the air carrying the smell of soil that had been cold all winter and was warming now. They did it in the yard, not the courthouse, not the church, not anywhere official. Just the yard of the Hail Ranch with the new barn behind them and the south pasture beyond and the north ridge in the distance with its scrubby trees just beginning to show leaf. Garrett officiated because he had the legal authority and because Margaret liked him and because he was practical about it, wrote nothing down, just asked them what they wanted to say and let them say it. Hank was there, Dell in the other hands, Dora with her notebook open out of habit, and then, at some point, closed. Sarah, standing to Jonas's left, looking at the sky and at the ground and anywhere other than her brother's face because she was not going to cry twice in 1 year, and she intended to hold that position. Margaret wore the burgundy dress, the good one, the one Thomas had liked and she'd worn to the first court hearing and had decided afterward to use again for things worth wearing it for. Jonas wore a clean shirt and the good boots and had cut his hair, which was an event Sarah had apparently supervised with considerable input. There were no flowers. There were no candles. There was nothing decorative or elaborate, because neither of them were decorative or elaborate people, and a ceremony that didn't match the people in it seemed like a waste of everyone's time. Garrett said, "You both know what you're agreeing to. Say it to each other." She looked at Jonas. He looked at her. She said, "I choose you. Knowing what I know and having seen what I've seen, I choose this, and I choose you." He said, "I choose you. I didn't know what I was walking into when I rode into this territory, and I don't need to, because whatever came with it, whatever comes next, I'd walk into it again if it brought me here." Garrett said some legal words, and that was it. Sarah made a noise that was definitely not crying and walked off toward the barn to check on a mare that probably didn't need checking on. Dora shook Margaret's hand and Jonas's hand and wrote one line in her notebook and showed it to neither of them. Hank said, "About time," which was the most words he'd put together at once in months, and went back to work. Dell cheered. He was the only one who cheered, and he did it without self-consciousness, which was the right call. They ate lunch in the yard. Margaret had cooked and Sarah had helped, and between them they'd produced enough food for twice the people present. And the afternoon was warm enough to sit outside in coats, and the light on the prairie was the good spring light that makes the grass look almost gold. She sat beside Jonas, with her shoulder against his, and her coffee warm in her hands, and looked at the land. The whole shape of it, the fence lines and the ridges and the south pasture and the barn, sat under the afternoon sky exactly as it had the first morning she'd stood on the porch and known she was going to fight for it. It was still hers. She had kept it. And it was more than hers now, which was something Thomas had wanted for it, had wanted children in those empty rooms, had wanted the ranch to grow past the two of them into something larger. She thought about this without grief, or mostly without grief, or with the kind of grief that has found its proper size and lives alongside everything else without swallowing it. She thought, I kept it, Thomas. And it became something. She found out she was pregnant in July. She sat with that knowledge for a full day before telling Jonas, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she wanted one day of knowing it herself, privately, the way you hold something precious before you show it to anyone else. She told him that evening on the porch. The porch had become the place for the things that mattered, she'd noticed, the place they'd somehow designated without discussing it for truth-telling. He went very still when she told him, the particular stillness. Say something, she said. I'm saying something, he said. Internally. Externally. He turned to look at her. His face had something in it she'd never seen exactly before, unguarded in a new way, stripped down to something simple, something that looked, she thought, like a man who has arrived somewhere he stopped believing he'd ever get to. Are you... He stopped. Started again. Are you all right? Are you... I'm fine, she said. I'm good, actually. He exhaled. A long, slow thing, like the first one she'd ever seen from him. On the porch months ago, after Morrison signed the documents, that huge, slow release of something carried too long. Same breath. Different weight. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. He reached over and took her hand. Didn't say anything else. They sat like that in the evening light with the prairie going gold around them and the ranch holding its ground in every direction, and neither of them needed to say what they were thinking because they were thinking the same thing. That this was real. That they had built it out of something that started wrong and survived things that should have broken it and come out the other side not unscathed, definitely not unscathed, both of them carrying marks from it, but intact, themselves, together. The people who had tried to reduce Margaret to a deed and a widowhood had not managed it. The man who had spent 8 years trying to hunt Jonas Reed to a reckoning he'd decided was owed had not managed it. The law that had tried to make her property had not managed it. What had managed to reduce her was nothing. She had refused to be smaller than what she was, and she had found someone who didn't want her smaller. And they had built something on that foundation. She thought, this is what survival looks like from the inside. Not victory, not triumph, just this. A porch, a hand in yours, the land you refuse to lose, still here. It's not a clean story. Nothing real is clean. There are pieces of it she doesn't think about in the daylight. The barn fire, the canyon, the specific sound the courthouse made when Crane stamped those documents. There are nights she still turns to the wrong side of the bed and has one half-asleep moment of wrongness before she remembers where she is. Thomas is still in the kitchen table and the calendar by the stove and the fence lines he helped run. He doesn't leave because she doesn't want him to leave. But there is also this. Jonas's hand in hers, Sarah's voice from inside the house arguing with Hank about something involving the feed schedule. The baby that is still becoming. The ranch that held on. The widow who was treated like property became something the territory hadn't expected. Herself. The drifter who arrived as someone's target stopped running. The land that started as scrub and rattlesnake produced something worth fighting for. And the prairie under the summer sky went on in every direction, enormous and indifferent and patient, the way it had always been. The way it would go on long after all of them were finished. Not caring what had happened on its surface, but holding the record of it anyway, the way land does. The way everything worth keeping does. End.